Hello, welcome back to Reviving History. This week, we'll be starting a three-part mini-series on the generals that defeated Napoleon. For this episode, we'll be discussing the British Army and generalship at Waterloo. This episode will cover organization, tactics, and leadership. Alrighty, let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. The British Army during the Napoleonic Wars was extremely underfunded and overshadowed by the Royal Navy, the first line of defense against invasion of the home islands and global trade. Regardless, the Duke of Wellington was able to turn a small army into a professional fighting force that was able to score countless victories in Portugal and Spain. Wellington was able to liberate Spain from France in spite of incompetence and bureaucratic malaise between both Britain and Spain. Wellington only fought battles when he knew there would be low casualties because he could not replace his losses. Wellington used a web of intelligence to learn about the French before each battle. Fighting a war on a shoestring budget made him surgical in his battles, fighting defensively when he could. The Peninsula War made him a master of defensive warfare. Wellington believed that whoever had the most reserves won the battle. During a defensive action, he would move troops from quiet parts of the front line to the contested regions and then smash the attackers when he had achieved tactical superiority. At heart, Wellington was an infantryman, and the whole army would operate around supporting the infantry. His low-powered, fast-moving artillery worked in tandem with the infantry, unlike Napoleon, who used mass concentrations of artillery as an offensive weapon. Wellington also had a small amount of cavalry. He was not confident in using them to their full potential. Experiences he learned in fighting in India made Wellington a logistics wizard. Wellington had built an intricate system of supply chains that were delivered from the Royal Navy and transported to the army by ox and horse. Along with the help from the Spanish and Portuguese, the British were usually more supplied than their French counterparts. Technically speaking, the British infantry were a majority of the time better disciplined and equipped than the French. The British would fire in a two-line formation to devastating effect against skirmisher and infantry alike. They were disciplined in the old-school art of drill and formations, making them operationally effective in all kinds of situations. With ease, they could form squares to defend against cavalry charges, then reform and go back to fighting in lines, like we'll see at Waterloo. One of the many reasons why this tactic worked so well for him was because of the rough terrain of Spain, causing the French to fight piecemeal and in bottlenecks, along with the fact that the French troops were of a poorer quality. Before we talk about the battle itself, I want to first talk about Wellington's commanders that he had with him during the battle. To begin, we'll start with the commander of the First Corps, General William, Prince of Orange. At the age of 23, he was only able to take command due to his noble birth. Wellington had no choice but to give him command due to the persistence of his father, or he would lose the Dutch military support that he desperately needed. The Prince of Orange knew that he was only a political appointment, but made up for it with determination and courage. Before Waterloo, he served with Wellington for 3 years in Spain as his aide-de-camp. At the Battle of Cahaba, he was able to hold off set attacks from Marshal Ney till Wellington arrived. During the Battle of Waterloo, he would take command of the center and got wounded while leading from the front. During the campaign, the Prince of Orange commanded Wellington's best troops in an attempt to balance his inexperience. Next up, the Second Corps under Lord Hill. He took command of the left wing during the Battle of Waterloo and served all throughout the Peninsula War under Wellington, fighting with distinction. He was known for his cool and collective leadership with his men. During the Battle of Waterloo, he spent the first part of the day in reserve and only fought during the latter part of the battle, fighting off the charges from Marshal Ney's cavalry onslaught and holding off the attack of the Old Guard. Next, we have the Anglo-Allied Army Cavalry Corps Commander, Lieutenant General the Earl of Uxbridge, who fought with Wellington during the Peninsula War, but left early, running away with Wellington's sister. Wellington obviously did not like the Earl of Uxbridge, but needed him for the upcoming campaign. He fought a successful rearguard during the retreat from Cahaba to Waterloo. During the battle, he shattered a French assault in the center, but he got overextended and was defeated by Polish lancers. Near the end of the day, a random artillery shell took off his leg, taking him out of the fighting. And last we have the 5th Division under Lieutenant General Sir Thomas Picton. The 5th Division first saw action at Cahaba and later at Waterloo under the command of Picton, who was a stubborn leader. He was killed in action during a bayonet charge during the French assault on the center around 3:30. Picton fought in the Peninsula War and suffered from PTSD. Before the battle, he had dug his own grave, believing correctly that he was not going to return home. During the voyage to Europe, Picton lost his uniform and wore a civilian suit during the battle. Wellington took command of a joint British-Dutch force shortly after Napoleon's return in 1815. A majority of his best troops were fighting in America at the time and were not able to get to Belgium in time for the battle. Wellington was afraid of how a massive portion of his Belgian contingent in the army spoke French, and he believed that they would be more loyal to Napoleon than to him. Out of the 22 British battalions he had, 15 of them served with him before in Spain. Still, the number in these regiments had been depleted due to years of fighting, and fresh recruits replenished their ranks but had little experience. 92,000 men would serve under Wellington, with only a small portion of them being combat ready. In an attempt to counter this, Wellington decided to mix the Dutch, Belgian, and German troops along with his more experienced British units to make up for their lack of experience. This was a common tactic in the Napoleonic Wars. The less experienced troops learned a lot faster when the regiments were mixed. Wellington and Blucher planned the attack only when they had total superiority with the help of the Austrian and Russian armies. In the meantime, they put their armies in a defensive position with scouts watching the many winding roads to Brussels. Neither general were expecting a surprise attack from Napoleon, which is strange. The invasion of Belgium and the plan to defeat each army in detail is textbook Napoleonics. A possible reason might be that Wellington believed that if Napoleon did attack, it would be along the coast to cut his supply lines off from England, his greatest fear. This makes sense. Wellington was logistically minded, unlike Napoleon, who had most of his men live off the land. Blucher and Wellington were spread out around 50 miles apart. This was partially due to supply and intelligence reasons. On the 15th, the attack began, with Napoleon pressing to Charleroi slower than what he wanted. This frustrated Napoleon to no end. At first, Wellington did not believe that the push to Charleroi was a real attack. He feared it was a feint maneuver for him to move to Blucher and open his supply lines from being cut. The biggest criticism of Wellington during the Waterloo campaign was that he did not march his army to save Blucher during the opening battles. Napoleon achieved his objective of crossing the Sambre and then divided his army, sending Ney just sort of Quatre-Bras. Blucher retreated to the village of Ligny and waited for Napoleon to attack. The fate of the Battle of Quatre-Bras rests solely on the French, particularly between Ney and Napoleon. Napoleon wanted Ney to take the vital crossroad and swing his force around to attack the Prussians at Ligny, destroying the Prussian army and knocking them out of the war. Then, and only then, Napoleon planned on attacking the British. This plan was textbook, but Ney was confused by the orders he received from Napoleon. The orders did not outline the primary and secondary objectives of the battle, along with the fact that the army's organization in the French army was a total mess, with Ney wasting a whole morning not attacking the small Dutch army that held the road under the Prince of Orange. If Ney did attack earlier, like he should have, he could have easily taken the road and smashed into Wellington, whose whole army was marching set-piece to the fighting. Then he could have swung around and smashed into the Prussians like Napoleon intended. Wellington methodically marched to save Blucher, but instead brought his men to Quatre-Bras to check Ney. Wellington could not save Blucher and stop Ney at the same time. Blucher ironically planned for the same attack as Napoleon, with Wellington bringing in his army in a flank attack. Blucher was left to face Napoleon alone. The fighting at Ligny turned into a devastating seesaw action, with Blucher being forced to retreat after a devastating French combined arms attack with artillery and old guard routing his lines. Meanwhile, at Quatre-Bras, Wellington's men would flood in and take defensive positions, while Ney attacked set piece. This kind of fighting was exactly the kind of warfare Wellington was great at, defense in depth. His superiority in infantry and skirmishing made up for him being outnumbered. Ney's attacks were set piece and slow, and were easily repulsed. Wellington was able to hold off cavalry charges, artillery onslaughts, and along with scattered infantry assaults. Once Wellington had his full force to bear, he went on the offensive, driving Ney's army from the field and winning a strategic victory. And tactical. The following day, on the 17th, Wellington received word from Blucher that his army was still intact and that he was heading north to Rav instead of heading back to Prussia. Wellington was relieved by this, knowing that their armies were still in the fight. Wellington still held the crossroad of Quatre-Bras and spent the previous night planning for his next move. Ney once again wasted another morning not attacking or regrouping like he should. Matter of fact, the whole Grand Armée did nothing for most of the day, giving the Allies time to regroup and retreat. Wellington planned to withdraw to the field of Waterloo, believing that it would be a better defensive position than Quatre-Bras. Wellington had seen the battlefield 2 years before and found it to be an excellent defensive position. The field would force the French to march half a mile on open ground to engage his men, who would be holding a highly defendable ridge. In the meantime, Wellington was now isolated and knew that at any moment Ney could attack with fresh reinforcements from Napoleon himself. Napoleon would be livid at Ney for not at least pinning down the British while he brought his force in to assist. Napoleon would scold Ney later on, saying, "You have lost France." Napoleon and Ney could have won the campaign in the early morning on the 17th, both the Allied armies shattered and regrouping, but still being close enough to be in a day's marching distance. If Napoleon sent Grouchy the very next morning to chase down the Prussians and had Ney pin down Wellington at least till Napoleon arrived, they could have won the campaign. Around 200 years later, this seems logical, but to understand Waterloo, you have to know that the French army at this point was a paper tiger, with sealess generals operating in positions they shouldn't have, and staff work being in total disarray, with vital orders arriving hours late. On top of that, Napoleon himself was failing in mental ability due to the cancer that ate at him, along with several other undiagnosed conditions that he could have possibly had. Wellington ordered a withdrawal. His cavalry fought a fierce rearguard action with Napoleon, who snapped out of his malaise and ordered a pursuit later in the afternoon. Heavy rain slowed the French pursuit, and the British were able to make it to Waterloo. Napoleon brought his army to Waterloo, and Grouchy was sent off to find the Prussians. The rain affected all three armies, and on the morning of the 18th, the rain had dissipated. Napoleon slightly outnumbered Wellington in size, but drastically outnumbered him in artillery, with more than 100 extra guns. Mud from the night's rain forced Napoleon to wait 3 extra hours to set up his artillery. Marshal Soult was afraid of waiting the extra 3 hours to attack, believing accurately that it only helped the Allies. Wellington shielded his men behind the hills to protect his reserve from artillery, along with garrisoning his men on the left side of the battlefield on the village of Hougomont, a rich farmhouse estate that was surrounded by walls and was easy to defend. He also had men take the village in the center part of the ridge, Les Sons, to protect the approaches there. Hougomont was highly defendable. Only a major infantry assault could take the town, and that would require a massive amount of troops, artillery, and time, all things Napoleon did not have. Unlike the French, the British had to only defend, a way simpler task. Wellington garrisoned his men in the villages on the center and right. All these positions were highly defensible, and during the battle, they were able to tie down French troops and were also able to fire on different parts of the battlefield that were trying to take the ridge. This was due to the fact that Waterloo itself is only 3 miles in length, so usually these muskets are highly inaccurate, but this time they were effective. All these garrisons had to do was climb to the second floor of one of these buildings and just fire upon the advancing enemy columns. The British were able to use the gunpowder of the French soldiers they killed, unlike the French who couldn't use the British powder. Wellington feared that Napoleon might simply outmaneuver and move his army to the left, circumnavigating the battlefield altogether, forcing him to retreat. Wellington left 17,000 Dutchmen 10 miles to the west to cover his retreat in case of that scenario. Blucher sent word to Wellington that he was coming to his aid and that he rallied his men. Blucher brought his men to Rav and left a rearguard there to keep Grouchy busy, and marched the majority of his army to Wellington's aid. At noon, the French left wing attacked. They moved to Huguenot through the woods and tried to storm the walls. Renier and Jerome Bonaparte made little progress in taking the town. Wellington committed his foot guard to help in the defense of the village. Napoleon planned to use his artillery to pound the center of Wellington's defenses and to have his army march forward and force the British off the ridge. To accomplish this, Napoleon wanted his troops to siege Hougomont. To hold the ridge, Wellington would have to recommit his forces to defend Hougomont. With a majority of his reserves committed at Hougomont, Napoleon then planned to commit his infantry to march across the valley and take the center ridge that would be poorly defended. Jerome Bonaparte was put in command of the siege of Hougomont, but he wanted action, and to prove himself as the equal to his brother. He threw his infantry against the defenses of Hougomont to the disgust of Renier, who wanted to follow the original orders of Napoleon by only sieging the chateau. Repeated attacks failed to crack the British, who were able to hit the French accurately as they tried to scale the walls. The French stormed the walls twice during the day, almost taking the compound, but were thrown back. The only thing that the endless attacks against Hougomont achieved was a loss of precious reserves that would be missed later in the day. Attacks on Hougomont would last most of the day and would happen in tandem with other parts of the battle. Around 2 in the afternoon, Napoleon had his heavy guns pound the center to prepare for an infantry assault. Wellington reverse-sloped the majority of his men during the bombardment and ordered his men to lay down behind the hill. This saved a lot of lives from the merciless heavy guns. The only guns that were able to hit the British behind the slope were French howitzers. They fired like a modern-day mortar, firing up into the air and landing on unsuspected targets. Luckily for the British, the French howitzers were not effective on the battlefield that day, due to the shells mostly landing in the mud and preventing them from causing too much damage. Wellington did not have enough cannons to counter the French and did not order them to return fire. He instead had them wait and load canister shot, the modern-day equivalent of a shotgun, to blow through the ranks of the assaulting French. Darwin committed his infantry, and for a brief moment the French assault and artillery bombardment looked like it worked. Darwin had fought the British before and knew that the British would try to grind his men down with their devastating two-line deep rank fire. To counter this, he had his divisions on his left and right in a pre-firing position, while his center divisions were in columns. Darwin's plan made logical sense, but did not take into account cavalry charges. While the French crossed the valley, Wellington let his cannons fire into the advancing line. Much like a picket's charge, the newly formed lines were torn open. In spite of this, the French conquered the guns and for a brief time took the ridge. But the devastating effect of the British line and a counter-charge led by Uxbridge threw the French attackers off the ridge, turning the assault into a rout. The British cavalry, after finishing off the French, ran straight for Napoleon's guns. In return, Napoleon ordered his Polish lancers to counter. The British cavalry was then defeated in detail. Wellington never trusted his cavalry. He was never confident in implementing them, believed that they were always inferior to French cavalry. The only cavalry that Wellington trusted in his army, King's German Legion cavalry. At Salamanca, Wellington committed his cavalry to devastating effect, but that was under Major General Jean Marchand, the best cavalry commander of the Napoleonic Wars. Unfortunately for Wellington, he died during the fighting at Salamanca. During this time, the Battle of Huguenot intensified, with Napoleon ordering howitzers to fire on the walls and into the buildings to attempt to burn the British out, but this still didn't work, and the British stubbornly held on. Around 5 in the afternoon, Marshal Ney saw thousands of men and wagons were leaving the battlefield. Thinking it was withdrawal, he ordered his cavalry to charge. Ney always led from the front. As noble as it was a critical mistake of him not getting the overall tactical picture. Ney got tunnel vision during the charge, throwing away the last of Napoleon's cavalry. He attacked without infantry support and failed to use the attack as cover to bring forward artillery. The attack was set piece and failed. The reason why the British were leaving the battlefield in such large numbers was due to the wounded, who had to walk all the way to Brussels for medical attention. What started off as a trickle turned into a flood of red coats. When they attacked, the British-Dutch guns fired into the massive horde of cavalry, decimating their lines. The British line would then calmly form squares and decimate the French cavalry. The French would attack, retreat. The British would then, during these lulls in the fighting, remand the cannons and fire at the regrouping French cavalry. So during the entirety of the attack, the French were under sustained fire. Along from the buildings of Huguemont and Le Saint, the attack lasted over 2 hours, with Wellington riding in and out between the squares with a calm, reassuring demeanor. During this time, the Prussians had shown up in force. Napoleon moved in reserves to slow the Prussians. Frustrated by the failed cavalry sorties, Ney ordered infantry to attack the squares now. The infantry moved up slowly, with no artillery or no cavalry support. Immediately, the British reformed to their lines and threw the infantry off the ridge. The fall of the center of Le Saint happened around 6, with the Prussians arriving in force, pressing the French and forcing Napoleon to send a portion of reserves to hold. Ney, who occupied Le Saint, brought up the artillery that now rained down on the British, whose protection with the reverse slope now failed. Even with the Prussians at Waterloo, Napoleon still had a chance of winning. The Prussians were arriving piecemeal. In theory, Napoleon could have broken the British, then swung around to face the Prussians, salvaging the failing situation. Napoleon decided to order his old guard, along with the remnants of the remaining infantry, to be reformed one last time, to break the British once and for all, under the cover of his infamous artillery that finally could fire down on the British. This assault inevitably failed. Heavy fire from the British canister shots, along with the elite foot guard, King's German Legion, and 52nd Oxford elite infantry, and firing down on the Old Guard. They were all veterans of the Peninsula War, and they made short work of the Old Guard. Wellington rode up to be with his men, and then ordered them to wait in range to have the devastating effect that the two lines could offer. The Old Guard routed, and the battle was lost. To conclude, Wellington was able to hold off Napoleon through defense and depth warfare. He was able to grind down offensives against the ridge, purity in skilled infantry and line tactics, along with artillery placement. Wellington understood the shortcomings in his army, and he was able to overcome them. He knew better than to go tit for tat with Napoleon. For example, Wellington did not attempt to counter Napoleon's artillery. Instead, he reaffirmed his doctrine of having his guns exclusively support the infantry. For the majority of the battle, his men were reverse sloped and shielded for the majority of the day from the full brunt of Napoleon's guns. Even his cavalry, the least effective arm in his army, implemented correctly. Uxbridge was able to rout the French during the first attack on Wellington's center. Wellington, during the battle, rode around to be with his men to reassure confidence. He was able to keep control over his men, preventing them from routing during the many assaults against the ridge. Wellington made all the right moves during the battle, and only when he felt confident that he had his men secure, he marched down from the ridge and routed the French, ending the Napoleonic Wars once and for all. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.